I don't see any. Ms. Neighbor, would you have anything to say on that? Would you like to make a motion? I know I don't want to deny you.
I'd love to make a motion, but since the rules have kind of changed in the format, I respect your just looking and knowing that they're perfectly written.
All right.
Thank you. I make a motion to accept the minutes.
Okay. Unless there's any objections, the minutes have been accepted. Thank you, Ms. Neighbor. Now we've got an overview from the Southwest Power Pool. We've got a couple of new people on here. We've got one in attendance right now. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Southwest Power Pool, but hopefully you will be after we're done. So I'd like to welcome Mike Ross, who's the Senior VP of External Affairs. And Mike, you've got kind of an interesting background. You might start off and just kind of tell them what you've done through the years. So other than that, welcome to the committee, sir.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mike Ross, Senior Vice President for External Affairs at Southwest Power Pool. We run the electric grid for all or part of 14 states, keep the lights on, facilitate the wholesale electric market, and plan high voltage transmission for the entire region. And I'll try to give you kind of a thumbnail sketch this morning and leave time for some questions of kind of about who we are, what we do, and what we do to benefit the citizens of Kansas. And to the chairman's point, let me just thank you for what you do. I had the privilege to spend 10 years in the Arkansas State Senate back in the 90s. Yes, I'm getting old. And then I spent 12 years in the U.S. House of Representatives representing Arkansas. I was a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. In fact, EPAC 05, the last significant energy legislation to come out of Washington, occurred when I was on the committee there. But I know the sacrifice you make and your families make, so thank you for your service to the good people of Kansas. And it's good to be here with you today. I'm doing that on. Let's see. All right, so our mission is working together to responsibly and economically keep the lights on today and in the future. And our vision statement, leading our industry to a brighter future while delivering the best energy value. And this morning, I hope to show you how we're accomplishing those things. I won't go through all this, but just the point is, we've been around since 1941. Coordinating power in one fashion or another. Utilities in Kansas have been a big part of that throughout our history, and we continue to evolve as technologies change. We continue to change with the time. The only thing certain these days in our industry is change, and we'll talk more about that, and I bet there'll be some questions about it here in a little bit as well. So we do a lot of things, but the big three is operations, running the grid, if you will, keeping it electrified, keeping it from getting overloaded or underloaded, keeping the lights on. That's first and foremost. Secondly, we facilitate the wholesale electric market. And then finally, we plan transmission across the region, and we'll touch on all three of those this morning. Now, things that we do not do, because sometimes people think we do these things. I like to say we don't do the controversial things. So we don't site transmission. We don't plan generation or site it. We don't construct transmission or generation, and we do not permit transmission or generation. Think air traffic controllers. If you think about it, you know, they don't own the airport, they don't own the sky, they don't own the airlines, but they direct it all. And that's kind of what we do on behalf of our members. We don't own the generation, our members do. We don't get to decide what kind of generation is built. Whoever's building and making that investment in conjunction with folks like the KCC are determining what type of fuel mix you're going to have and what type of generation is going to be built. And that's the region we serve today. It looks a lot like a Texas congressional redistricting map. And the reason for that is electricity is traveling at nearly the speed of light, and it does not know state boundaries. It knows the boundaries of transmission lines. And that's why each of the 7 regional transmission organizations in the United States look the way they do. They're following transmission lines. But our service territory, over 500,000 square miles. We serve over 18 million people, including all the people in Kansas, almost 1,000 generating plants, and over 5,000 substations. So a lot of infrastructure.
Before you go on, we've got a couple new people here. What is an RTO? Maybe
So-
just touch on it a little
So
bit.
a regional transmission organization, or sometimes called an ISO, an independent system organization, they're both synonymous. And basically, we do the things that I've described. And the governance structure and the way it works is you can't just decide you want to be one. You're designated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. You're a nonprofit. And our governance structure is designed, everything we do is based on a tariff that eventually has to work its way to FERC and get approved. But all the policies start at the ground level, at the state level, and work their way up. So all of our members have a seat at the table. And kind of, to put it in legislative terms, there's a group called the Markets and Operations Policy Committee. So all 120 members of SPP, they've got a seat at that table, and they debate the issues and actually try to follow Robert's Rules of Order and go through a process, and amendments are offered, and they finally vote. And if that passes, then it works its way up to our members committee and our independent board of directors for them to consider. And then if they approve it, and then oftentimes in tandem with that, we have what's called the Regional State Committee, and your chairman here, Andrew French, is the immediate past president of the Regional State Committee. And so the Regional State Committee at SPP consists of a state regulator from each of the states that we serve. And they sit alongside the board for a briefing. They meet the day before our board meets. There's certain authorities they have that our board does not have, including resource adequacy and cost allocation, among a few others. So this guy here is your seat at the table from a regulatory side, helping govern SPP, and then our members, and they're all behind me. You know who they are, and they're involved. So you got the Markets and Operations Policy Committee. That's kind of like the House of Representatives, and then the Members Committee and board is kind of like the State Senate, and then between the state regulators and FERC, they act more like the governor, I guess, if you will.
I can inject one more comment, and again, because we've got some new people, Andrew, can you just stand up? And Andrew is with the Kansas Corporation Commission, so you will interface with him occasionally, but he's also our eyes and ears down there with the SPP. So good contact to have, and keep him in mind. So go ahead. Thank you.
All right, so our members, 118 members today, and basically membership is voluntary. There's no laws that say a utility has to join. They have joined because they see the value in being a member. And I'm proud to say that in terms of load serving entities, once they join, they stay because of the value they're providing their customers. So for example, in Kansas, and our members include Midwest, Sunflower, Evergy, KEPCO, KMEA, and ITC, for example, is a transmission owning member. And am I missing any? I'm doing it off the top. The Kansas Board of Public Utilities. Anyone else? Oh, Liberty has a piece of Kansas. Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yep.
You give us time, we'll come
The old Empire District. Liberty. I think that covers them. And so that's the members from Kansas that we work with. And so the Regional State Committee, I've already kind of gone through and explained this. There's Andrew's pretty picture up there, and he's the immediate past president of the Regional State Committee, and well respected, and has a very loud voice for Kansas as we work through our processes. And I've already covered that. Basically, the responsibilities they have, allocation of transmission rights, as well as resource adequacy and cost allocation for new transmission lines. And so here's the fuel mix from last year, hot off the presses, because it takes us a little bit of time to get it all added up. But in the SPP region, again, we don't decide what's built. It's our members, and oftentimes with approval from their state regulators, that decide what's built. And we don't pick the winners and losers. We facilitate the wholesale electric market. So our job is to forecast, okay, this morning they're forecasting how much power is needed tomorrow across our region. And then they open up and facilitate the wholesale electric market. And so those generators that want to run tomorrow, they bid in. And the lowest cost that gets us to what we need for tomorrow to keep the lights on is what they get paid. So it ensures lowest cost generation runs first. There's also a big reliability component to it because they're making a commitment under financial penalty that they'll show up tomorrow. And so that's a key element of the market, is making sure we've got the generation tomorrow to meet the demand that's going to be there tomorrow. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But as you can see, wind's our number one fuel source at about 38% of the fuel mix. Natural gas, for the first time, passed coal and is now our number two fuel source at 28%. Coal's at 24%. Nuclear is at about 5%. Hydro's at about 3%. Very little solar today, but you'll see in a little bit we've got a lot more solar planned. And other, which would include battery, very little of that today, a little over 0.1%, but a significant amount of that is planned for the future as well. Then if you drill down and look at Kansas, there's Kansas. 51% of the energy in Kansas is coming from wind, 24% from coal, about 9% from gas. And of course, y'all are the big provider of nuclear within our region. 16% of the power here is coming from nuclear. But if you look at the right-hand side, your load is about 45,000 megawatts. As you can see, you're generating about 55,000 megawatts. That means you're a net exporter. And that's one of the reasons SPP is so important for Kansas, is it gives you a market on where you can move that energy and be paid for it, and at the end of the day, save end-use customers money. And then this is kind of interesting to look at in terms of the evolving fuel mix. In terms of actual production, wind's up 87% since 2017. Largely, it has replaced coal. Coal's down 40%. But look at gas. Gas is up 62%. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the slide I've got in a moment about why that's happening. But basically, the more wind on the system, you're going to see gas continue to go up as well. That's what's happening in Kansas. I don't know if you can see, but wind's leading in terms of actual fuel production. 27% is wind. What is that? Nuclear is 16, and no, gas. I'm sorry. Gas is. They're missing a guide down there at the bottom, aren't they? 27 wind, 16 gas, 10 is nuclear. No, I'm sorry. Gas is, that's right. Okay, so coal is still in second place in Kansas, followed by nuclear, and then not a lot of gas in Kansas. There we go. So wind generated by state, only Oklahoma puts more wind on the system than you all. Y'all are in second place. It increased from 20 from megawatt hours. You went from 26 million in 23 to 29 million in 24, making up about 26% of the wind energy in the SPP region. And then y'all are followed by Nebraska, Texas, and other. Texas, obviously, as a state, is larger. Again, these regions follow transmission lines. So we have Northeast Texas and the Panhandle of Texas. So that percent up there coming from Texas is largely in the Panhandle. And the rest of Texas is isolated from the Eastern and Western interconnect, which is why they had so many issues during Winter Storm Uri. In fact, the financial impact to Texas was $100 billion and 250 lives. In that same event, we had a controlled outage that affected about 6% of the people over a period of about 3 hours. And so being part of a region makes a huge difference. And then import versus export, you can see there in terms of exporting, it's in the green in the far right column, and 29% of the energy in Kansas is exported. Compare that, South Dakota's at 36%. North Dakota only 2%. So why fuel diversity matters. And this is why, as you see more wind on the system, you're going to see more gas. Not only do we have to forecast the load a day in advance, we're having to forecast the wind weeks in advance. Because you don't just push a button and turn on a large coal or gas plant. They have to ramp up. And so we got to be real good at forecasting the wind so we see what's coming. We forecast this, so there was not a reliability event. But we lost 14,000 megawatts of wind in 4 hours. Now what's 14,000 megawatts? Basically that means we needed to turn on 28 large coal or gas plants. And so because of the variability with the wind, when the wind's blowing, there's no fuel cost associated with the wind, right? And so it brings prices down, but then you got to have something to address the variability of wind. And largely that's gas, and largely it's the fast start, quick start natural gas units that typically run from anywhere from 25 to 200 megawatts. On those, you can literally push a button, and under 5 minutes later, they're producing very close to their nameplate. And so as you see more wind on the system, you're going to see more gas, because gas is how we address the variability associated with wind. So what's planned for the future? Again, we don't decide what's built. It's our members, and often in consultation with their state regulators. But as you can see, 35% of the future energy mix within our 14-state region is solar. So we're going to see solar take off in the next few years. Battery storage makes up about 20%. Wind makes up about 19%. And thermal continues to grow, which actually is a good thing from a resource adequacy perspective. And thermal would be all that there is gas. So almost 12,000, and that's actually increasing almost daily. So almost 12,000 megawatts of gas is planned in our region today. So the SPP markets, I think I pretty much already explained how the day ahead market operates. The real-time market closes every 5 minutes. It settles every 5 minutes. So the real-time market, maybe someone committed to run tomorrow and the machine broke. These are large machines, right? So maybe it broke and they couldn't run. Or maybe we missed a wind forecast by 1 or 2%. And if there's 35,000 megawatts of wind on the system that day and you miss it by 1 or 2%, that ends up being equivalent to one large coal or gas plant, right? So the real-time market fills in the gaps and settles every 5 minutes. And then transmission service market, basically in the old days, if Midwest had some energy they wanted to sell to someone but had to cross 4 different transmission owners to move it, they would have to pick up the phone. They'd have to call 4 different companies, find out if they had room on their line, and negotiate a price. And so with us, all that happens seamlessly, and we're a one-stop shop for facilitating the movement of energy from point A to point B or C or D involving multiple transmission lines. And so we're nonprofit, so we collect the money from those who are paying to use it, and then it goes out to those that own the line. And same way it works with the markets as well. And then for the last few years, we've had a Western Energy Imbalance Service market operating in the West, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So market facts, I won't go through all those, but In 2023, I don't have 24 numbers yet, but in 2023, the marketplace settled almost $35 billion from nearly 1,000 generating resources across the region. The transmission market, I just explained how that worked, but you'll have the slide if you want to review to it in your leisure. And I'm proud to say that we have the lowest wholesale electric rates in the United States of America. You would not want to be paying for electricity in California, $64, or Texas, $80. In the SPP region, $31.67. Those are 2023 numbers provided by FERC. That's not us. So transmission in the system, again, we're doing the modeling and the studies and forecasting how much transmission is needed, where are upgrades needed to meet the growing need for electricity well into the future. And as you can see, our independent board has issued notices to construct about $12 billion worth of transmission upgrades. And that is changing rapidly. Just late last year, they approved an additional $7.7 billion, including our very first 765 line. We have a lot of 345 lines. It'll be the very first 765 line as we see this economy become more electrified. And we're going to have a lot of challenges, I think, going forward with that, with data centers and other parts of the economy that are demanding unheard of amounts of electricity. So that's where projects are constructed or with notices to construct. As you can see, there's a lot of them in Kansas. Oklahoma and Kansas have seen a lot of the transmission upgrades and new transmission in the last 15 years. Quite frankly, a lot of that's because y'all have a lot of wind. You got to get it from where it's made to where it's needed. The good thing about being part of a region is those high voltage lines weren't just paid for by the people of Kansas. It was spread across the entire region because it benefits the entire region. And that's planned expansion. As you can see, there's quite a bit more planned in Kansas. And then who pays for it? So if it's 300 kV or above, it's spread across the entire region. If it is above 100 but below 300, the local area pays 67%, the region pays 33%, and if it's the smaller lines, it's paid all locally. And that cost allocation methodology was approved by the regional state committee, the SPP Regional State Committee of state regulators, if you will. They determine that separate. It's a separate authority they have that our independent board does not have. And then I just would mention that we got a lot going on in the West, which will benefit Kansas because you'll have surplus energy, so you'll have more markets, more opportunities to be able to move the surplus energy. And so we got two things going on in tandem. One is the RTO is expanding to include a lot of, it's the darker green, a lot of Colorado into Arizona and Utah and a lot of Wyoming and even more of Montana and South Dakota. And the little piece of Nebraska that we didn't have, a very little piece is part of the expansion as well. Again, western states that are not in an RTO today really have two choices realistically. One is to join us, one's to join California, and quite frankly, there's a lot of people in the West that don't line up with California. And so we're going to see some growth to the West. And then separate from that, we're offering a contract service called Markets Plus. So there are some entities in the West that they're not ready to go full-blown RTO yet, but they want to put their foot in the water and they want to be a part of a market because they see how much money that can save them and their customers. And so Markets Plus is another product that we're launching that will touch almost every state in the West. That will be a separate market from the one we have here in the SPP RTO region. So a lot going on, and even with our growth, at least two of the, if not three of the regional transmission organizations will still be larger than us. So it's not something we can't handle. Quite frankly, you're able to grow without adding a lot more expense, which brings down the expense for the people of Kansas. And that's what we created for the region last year. And the methodology we use to calculate that has been approved by our members. And so across the 14-state region last year, we created, after expenses, we created $3.62 billion in savings. And a significant chunk of that goes to Kansas. And I believe that completes my presentation, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be glad to try and answer any questions anyone might.
No, I appreciate it. It was good presentation, Mike. Committee questions. Mr. Shu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, this is a 101 question. I am one of the new members. I don't think I look like a Schlingenziepen. So does the fact that Kansas does not have a state energy plan impact your planning at all? Does it make it more difficult to kind of look at long-term planning for energy? Would it be more helpful if we did have that?
I would almost defer that to Commissioner, Mr. Chairman French over there. We do our own planning. There are a few states that have like a planning authority that will work with us. But we're not just looking at one state, we're looking at the entire region. And so that's kind of a decision, I guess, for you all to make. I don't think it would have that much of an impact on us either way.
Andrew French, Kansas Corporation Commission. Yeah, I would agree. I think SPP is completely agnostic to whether we have a state energy plan. If we had one, that might impact the resources. It could filter into our utilities resource plans. It could filter into resources that get developed in the state outside of our utilities. And SPP, they're totally neutral to that. Whatever gets developed, they accommodate it through the grid. They have to. So they could be impacted by it, but they don't. It doesn't make their job more difficult or easier. They're neutral to that.
Ms. McDonald.
Hi. Can you hear me? Okay. Mr. Ross, thank you for being here today. I'm also a substitute on this committee, so it's really been a treat to get some of this information. And I'm a native of Arkansas. My mom, I grew up in Little Rock, and my mom was a career employee of Arkansas Power and Light and then Entergy. So one of my questions really is about geography. I was trying to discern from your map if the nuclear power plant in Russellville is attached to our
It is not.
Okay.
We have the Wolf Creek and Cooper in Kansas and Nebraska are the only two that we have in our region. Again, we follow transmission lines. And
Sure. It was just a little bit hard to tell on that map because it's
Entergy Arkansas is in a different RTO. It's a long story. I'd love to share it with you sometime, but
Thank you.
so we have the western half of Arkansas, the transmission system on the western half, which includes the largest and fastest growing areas of Arkansas, northwest Arkansas.
Thank you very much.
When did they turn down Calhoun up in Nebraska?
It's been maybe 12, I'm guessing 12 years ago. It's been a while, it's been a minute. Is that?
Yeah. Reason I asked that was a third nuclear plant. That
Right, it was.
See, I knew it was shut down, but I wasn't sure how long ago. Representative Smith.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here. If you could peek at slide 12 and 13, in Kansas, we're looking at building a couple gas power plants in the next 5 years or so. And as I look at 12, the amount of gas being used is a decent amount. But on slide 13, you know, if we're rich in natural gas, it doesn't appear to me that we're using very much of our own natural gas wealth. So how would you respond to that?
There is, it's now our number 2 fuel source. Quite frankly, gas would probably be number 1 if we didn't have so much wind on the system. And again, we don't get to decide what's built. We just, whatever's built, we got to figure out how to keep the lights on. That's our job, which can be challenging. And in fact, we have recently put out what we call our generational challenge. It's a report. You can go to spp.org and read the entire report. But basically, in that report, we're saying that we need more dispatchable generation. Dispatchable would be gas, coal, and we're starting to see that. We're starting to see, as these plants age, some are retiring, and a lot of them now are being replaced with gas. The challenge is there's such a demand, and the supply chain issue is such, with not only the parts to build these generators, but also transformers, is we've got members telling us that it's going to take them 5 years to be able to stand up a new gas plant. By the time they get the transformers in and the parts in, and so, but yes, I think you're going to see a lot more gas come online. As I showed on one of those slides, I mean, gas is up, in terms of gas production, it's up 62% since 2017, I believe. So we're seeing more and more gas, and I think you'll continue to see more gas. There's a place for every form of energy, but as we experience more extreme weather events, our peak load in this entire industry, you're looking at flat to about a 1, 2, maybe 3% growth annually. Our peak over the last 2 years has gone up 10%. So we had a peak that was 5% above the year before, and then we had a peak last year that was 5% above the year before that. So that's 10% increase. And that's before you start seeing a lot of movement toward these data centers. And we're starting to hear a lot of talk about data centers. And I'll just tell you that I don't know, the folks behind me could tell you better than me, but I'm not talking Wichita or Topeka, but your average size town out there, 10 to 15,000 people that have 1 or 2 industries, that whole town's running on 20, 25 megawatts. And a data center comes into that town and they're wanting 250 to 500 megawatts. And a 250 megawatt gas plant is $500 million. A 500 megawatt gas plant is $1 billion. And that's before you start talking about upgrading the transmission to be able to handle that much more power on the line. So, I mean, these numbers that we're hearing today are unprecedented. And I think it's going to lead to a lot of discussions at the state level going forward, because you also want to have enough power available for that industry that comes into some small community and puts 300 people to work. So that's going to be, I think, a challenge for folks like you around this table to grapple with in the coming years, and I think it's happening pretty fast.
Thank you. I think Chanute, and I've heard of others, the city, like you say, a town of 15 or 20,000, want to go independent and do their own. Would they still be members of the Southwest Power Plant, or am I making sense with that?
I wouldn't know how to answer that specifically. If they're a member of Kansas Municipal Energy Authority, then they may still be connected to us, or maybe all I can say is if they did that, good luck to them.
Well, I feel the same way. I say good luck to them. I don't like it either, but like I say, they're just talking. I think Chanute does it. So thank you.
One thing I would point out that's also increasing, the numbers keep going up on future planned gas production, is one of the things that we're addressing. So if you're a load serving entity and you're serving end use customers, you've got to show up to SPP with enough generation to meet your peak plus 15%, which is going to 16% next year. In tandem with that, we're now, back in the old days, we would look at nameplate. A 100 megawatt nameplate wind farm may be producing 10 to 30% of that. A nameplate gas or coal plant may be producing 90 or 95% of that. And so as members have to increase their reserve margin, you know, they've got to build a whole lot more wind or solar, because we're not looking at the nameplate, we're looking at the accredited value. We're looking at the historic value. What's it really producing? And so that alone, I think, is providing an incentive for a lot of people to start looking toward, especially these fast start, quick start natural gas plants, because they're going to be accredited much closer to their nameplate.
Thank you.
Although they can have issues, you know, Winter Storm Uri, the challenges we had were largely, it was all the above. Coal piles were freezing up, wind turbines were freezing up, but natural gas at the wellhead was freezing up. They couldn't get the gas out of the ground. It was a perfect storm.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Carmichael. Thank you. Mr. Ross, it's always good to see you here. I appreciate the courtesy and help that you gave me 12 years ago when I came to this committee in this legislature, and I'm still grateful for it, as with Ms. Lutz. But quite honestly, I'm increasingly coming to the conclusion that we don't need the SPP. That SPP in combination with investor-owned utilities are driving rate increases at a rate that my constituents can't afford to pay. Some of them don't have power today because they haven't been able to pay their electric bills for the last 6 months to a year. And I think there are two principal drivers. Number one is SPP notices to construct, SPP's raising the reserve, peak reserve capacity requirements, and decisions that you've made about accreditation. All of those things drive increased need for capital investment by our investor-owned utility, and my constituents can't afford it anymore. So when I hear you say long distance power transmission, high voltage transmission, it's going to be socialized or regionalized over the entire region. The problem is that the investor-owned utility in my district, I think, what is it? Evergy pays like 17% to build of the cost of power lines. In the Dakotas, 16%. In the Dakotas, in Oklahoma, in Northwest Texas. And then we have this thing about we're going to have data centers come online. And so everybody thinks that they have to build additional generating capacity right away in case one of these data centers happens to land in their territory. We can't afford it. So why shouldn't we just cut the wires, go on our own? And I certainly invite you to explain to me why I'm wrong, because I hope I am.
It's always good to see you. Let me just try to answer it this way. More of those transmission lines have been built in Kansas than anywhere else. Y'all are benefiting from the region sharing the cost, number one. Number two, as a result of the things that we have done, you have the lowest wholesale electric rates in the United States of America. And you want to look at the things, raising the reserve margin has got to be done to keep the lights on. No one wants the lights to go out. Every entity, whether they're in an RTO or not, are increasing their reserve margins because the demand for electricity continues to go up. So I think that's important to note. And then I would also point out that to get out, because basically the membership agreements with our members and the operating agreements, which is part also involved in our tariff is all these other states have helped pay for a massive amount of transmission that's been built largely in Kansas. So if you were to get out of SPP, you owe all those states back what they have paid for the transmission here. That would be several $billion. And then it would take at least 5 years to create your own balancing authority and stand up all the things we do. And that could be north of $1 billion. And then these entities that are members that operate in more than one state would have to spin off operating companies that would be limited to your state boundaries. So all this would take at least 5 years and it would cost, back of the envelope, probably north of $4 billion, which would be, if you think your customers are having trouble paying their light bill now, it would be the largest increase in the history of Kansas. And that's where we start talking about reliability. You see, as these winter events, winter and summer, as these extreme weather events happen, typically they move from west to east. And as they move across our region, we've got big pipes with MISO, they got big pipes with PJM. And as our demand goes up, and the storm hasn't hit them yet, they're able to share power with us. And then as the storm passes us and enters them, we're able to share power with them. Texas wanted to be an island. And as a result, $100 billion in damages and 250 people are no longer living. So obviously, I think it would be a huge mistake for a state. Texas can't do it with 30 million people. I don't think Kansas would fare any better, and probably worse.
Well, Mr. Chairman, you know, it's not just my constituents that ought to be worried about this. The people who get their electricity from Midwest Energy have paid a disproportionate share of the cost of transmission for years. And now to hear the SPP smile and say, we got you over a barrel, you can't get out, you're trapped. We need to find a way out if that's the way this works. To the investor-owned utilities that run the SPP, and the SPP thinks the state of Kansas that they've got us by, I'm not going to say what they've got us by, Mr. Chair, but we need to be thinking about the future and what we can afford. If it takes 5 years to do it, then let's get busy. Duly noted. And I have had conversations with Midwest. I know exactly what you're talking about, but let's move on to another subject here. Further questions? Representative Schreiber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mike. Appreciate the presentation. I kind of wanted to focus on the expansion to the west. Kind of two questions. One is we have limited flow gates that go back and forth. I don't know if that's a big concern right now for the SPP as they go west. The question is, who pays for those flow gates if they're expanded in some way? And the second is something you brought up a couple of times now, is on the environmental hazards, you know, Winter Storm Uri and so forth. But then it also brought to mind, especially now expanding into Colorado, Wyoming, and so forth, is wildfires, as you know, like they had in California. Does SPP get involved with those reliability concerns, like in the western states with wildfires, or ensuring utilities are properly insulated for some of these weather conditions that are coming through?
We're still a year or two away from all that happening, but yes, we would be involved with that, but that would largely fall to the local utility. And I know a lot of states in the West are looking at state laws and different issues related to wildfires and liability issues and prevention and so forth and so on. And we'd certainly have a seat at the table and be involved in that. On the flow gates, I think you're referring maybe to the DC ties. And so basically you've got the Eastern Interconnect, the Western Interconnect, and there's about 7 connections that connect them. And we operate all of those today because of where we fall. We butt up next to the Western Interconnect today. Those would operate as they do today. We're moving energy back and forth constantly across those today, and that wouldn't change. In terms of would there be upgrades in the future, I'm sure there would at some point in the future, just like there is to almost every transmission line.
And is that the SPP that or the member companies that pay for those?
It would,
There was a new.
it would largely be the state regulators from all the affected states would have a big say in figuring out the cost allocation on that, just like they do a transmission line, as I understand it.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Further questions? Ms. Bohai.
It'll be quick. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation. And looking at the 2023 annual average spot prices, showing that we have the lowest of any organized market in the United States. Number one, thank you, I think, right? Because you're out there making sure that we're getting the most economical energy. My question is, with wind, and we know that we have the great potential to harvest a ton of wind, do we have right now the potential to store that wind, to your knowledge? Or, like, I also understand if it's not windy, then we got to use the coal or gas plants, which I'm fine with, right? Like, that's great. But how do we continue to keep that price low so that our constituents could, I don't know, maybe eventually have lower energy? Because it looks like you're doing your job, but somehow we're still paying more.
So if you look on the slide about the generation interconnection queue, so we don't get to decide what's built, but we're required to do a study on how that new generation would reliably connect to the grid. Can that transmission line handle it? Does the transmission line need to be upgraded? So forth and so on. And if you look at that, I think about 15% of future generation plan is battery, is storage. And having battery storage next to a wind farm makes a lot of sense, because quite frankly, y'all have so much wind on the system today that when you're at night, load is low, demand is low, we're curtailing wind a lot when the wind blows the most at night and energy use is down, and we're curtailing it. And so if you think about it, if you could curtail it into a battery storage unit at the wind farm and then call on it as a separate generator during peak the next day, utilizing the same transmission line that already exists to the wind farm, it makes a lot of sense. And there's a future in that. But the technology today, it's about a 4-hour battery. And so in an extreme weather event, those typically can last days. And so I guess it helps for 4 hours, but it's not gonna keep the lights on during an extreme event. But to your other point, you're right. And I totally understand where Representative Carmichael's coming from. And I appreciate Wichita, right? And I appreciate him looking after my mother and father-in-law who live in Wichita. My wife is a graduate of Wichita Northwest. She said, "Go Grizzlies." And so I appreciate you looking after them. But the wholesale electric rate is just a small part of your electric bill. You've got transmission lines, you've got substations, you've got distribution lines, you've got generation that's been built to keep the lights on for the people in Kansas. And then the cost of recovering from a storm. I mean, there's a whole lot of different numbers that go into what the end use customer pays. I can tell you that without us, the bill would be more, not less.
I think we're going to try and wind this up here. Is Mr. Hoffman in the crowd yet? Mindy, can you get a hold of him? Okay. Okay, that's fine. Trying to get set up for our next one here. While we're waiting on that, you hit on the westward expansion. How much of that is complete at this point?
So the RTO expansion is set to take effect in 2026. The Markets Plus, which is a separate contract service that's totally being paid for by the folks in the West that are joining, that will go live hopefully in 27.
Okay.
And to put it in perspective, we've been working on that since around 2020.
Right.
I mean, these things, they just take, it's very complex.
So throughout the SPP region, are there any SMR projects happening at this time?
Not at this time. Referring to small modular reactors, you know, I think they have a future, and I think we'll probably see that. We may even see some large nuclear plants. Quite frankly, the first one built since the 70s was in Georgia. It's over $30 billion with a B. That 2,000 megawatts, had it been gas, would have been about $4 billion. Now, in defense, there hadn't been one built since the 70s, and they ran into a lot of trouble. But once you get one or two built, it gets more into the cookie cutter mode again, I believe, and the cost would come down. But will we see more large ones? I don't know. I think you're probably going to see some small modular reactors, and some of the first site for those may be military installations. But I think there's a future in it. But my guess is we're probably 10 years away from seeing one providing energy
All right.
across the region.
Appreciate it. I thank you for making the trip up here and
Thank you for
your
inviting me.
testimony. It's always good to have you in town, sir. So with that, we're going to move on to the hearing for House Bill 2110. Nick, what are we doing?
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, committee members. So committee, let's switch gears from electricity to telecommunications and 911 service. So last year, I'm just going to quickly kind of touch on what happened last year. Last year, the legislature, you all passed House Bill 2690, and this amended the Kansas 911 Act. And the Kansas 911 Act, just real fast, is an act, kind of the governance structure of how the 911 fees, there's 911 fees assessed on every phone bill, every landline phone, wireless phone, prepaid wireless phone. And these fees then go to support the hosted solution, the state 911 network, essentially. The entity that oversees this 911 system is currently the 911 Coordinating Council, and last year's bill kind of made some changes with how the governance structure is set up, and then how those funds are dealt with. So last year, you all switched the 911 Coordinating Council to become more of a state agency, a state-based agency. So it will become the state 911 board effective July 1, 2025. Then also that legislation established or provided for the establishment of 3 funds within the state treasury. Currently, all the funds that are collected from 911 fees are placed within 3 corresponding funds that are outside of the state treasury. And this legislation last year moves these funds over to the state treasury into 3 corresponding funds within the state treasury. And then it directs that all the 911 fee monies are then going to be funneled into the state treasury. Those funds outside the state treasury are going to be gone. And then that's kind of the overarching changes that were made to the bill. There were some other changes, increasing distributions to the PSAPs and governing bodies, and some other things within that legislation. So this bill, unless anybody has any questions on that, Mr. Chairman, this bill, House Bill 2110, is somewhat what you could call a trailer bill to that piece of legislation from last year. So this bill, it will amend some of those delayed sections of law that were happening in 2025, 2026. So this bill, it will remove the requirement that the state board has to contract with an LCPA, a local collection point administrator, and I'll get into that here soon. I'm just touching on it real fast, and then we'll get into them. This bill will reschedule when the monies are to be established and placed into the state treasury, and when that transfer is to occur. It will require an immediate transfer of operations fund monies into the state treasury fund. It'll authorize the board to make some discretionary annual transfers from the state operations fund to the grant fund, and then it will remove a transfer fee cap on the state 911 grant fund. I'll get into a little bit more details on those right now. So the first thing that this bill is doing is current law requires the state 911 board to contract with what is known as an LCPA, a local collection point administrator. And the local collection point administrator is the entity, the contracted entity that collects all the 911 fee monies and then distributes all those 911 fee monies from those funds that are held outside the state treasury. So what this bill would do is it would remove that requirement. Currently, there's some requirements that the board can only contract with this entity for 2 years, and then they can extend it for another 2 years. And then if they want to change the entity, it has to be approved. That new entity has to be approved by the Legislative Coordinating Council. So this law or this bill would do away with those requirements. The board would no longer have the statutory requirement to contract with an LCPA. I will note that the board's duties and authority does allow the board to continue to contract with any entity to fulfill its duties and obligations. So the board, if it so chooses, can continue to contract with an entity like the LCPA for services, but this just will not be a requirement in the law anymore. It sunsets the LCPA provision on January 1, 2026, and then it will, this bill takes away, removes any references to the LCPA that remain in the law. The next thing this bill do is it reschedules when the new funds are to be established in the state treasury and when the monies are to be transferred to the funds. The prior law provided that the new funds would be established on January 1, 2026, and then the transfer was to happen on January 1, 2026. This bill would require the new funds to be established on July 1, 2025. So get those funds set up in the state treasury July 1, 2025. And then the transfer is just delayed by 1 day. So the transfer, instead of January 1, 2026, the transfer will occur on January 2, 2026. And that's when all those monies that are held outside the state treasury will be transferred to the new funds within the state treasury. The third thing this bill will do is it will require an immediate transfer from the operations fund that's held outside the state treasury into the new operations fund that's going to be inside the state treasury, and it will require a $1 million operations fund transfer into the state treasury fund to fund the operations of the state 911 board. And then this bill would authorize the state board, and this will kind of tie into the next thing I'm going to talk about. This will authorize the state board to transfer once per calendar year any monies in the state operations 911 operations fund that are unencumbered from a prior fiscal year. That it'll authorize the board to transfer those unencumbered monies into the state grant fund to be used for state grant fund purposes. And again, this can happen once per fiscal year, and it's going to be, if the board chooses, it's the unencumbered monies in the operations fund. So any monies that aren't necessarily needed in the operations fund anymore, the board can transfer those over to the grant fund. The last kind of major piece that this bill does is it changes the cap on how the monies go into the state grant fund. So current law directs how this 90-cent telephone bill fee distributed through the three funds, and where the prepaid wireless funds also go. So currently for the 911 fees that are on telephone bills, 23 cents goes to the state operations fund. 1 cent of each 911 fee is to be deposited into the state grant fund, but that's only when the balance of that grant fund is less than $2 million. And then otherwise that 1 cent is not transferred into to the grant fund. And then the remaining amount would be deposited into the state 911 fund for distributions to PSAPs. So this takes away, this bill would take away that $2 million threshold for the transfer into the state grant fund. So under this bill now, that 23 cents would still be directed to the operations fund. The 1 cent would be directed to the grant fund no matter the balance of the grant fund, and then the remaining amount would be deposited into the state 911 fund for distributions to PSAPs. And Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I'd be happy to stand for questions. I know that's quite a bit, but just kind of a trailer piece of legislation to last year's bill.
Sure. Committee questions for Nick? All right. And as we go through this, I may have to call on Mr. Carmichael here and there. You sit on the 911 council, so.
Along with Representative Hoffman, we are the representatives of the speaker and the minority leader, and this is a wonderful bipartisan effort that's gone on for the past 2 years. Thanks for saying that.
Okay. We're trying to get Mr. Hoffman up here. He's on his way, but in the meantime, if I could get Sherry Massey. Ms. Massey is the executive director for the Kansas 911 Consul. Welcome to the committee.
Morning. I think Nick did an excellent job of explaining what's in the bill, and I know it's quite complicated. So I wanted to address just a couple of reasons. Why some of the items are in there. Currently, the State 911 Grant Fund has a cap of $2 million, after which the 1 cent that is dedicated to it moves out to 911 centers. If the council is going to be able to move unencumbered money into the grant fund, we're going to top that $2 million cap pretty quick. And that means that we're going to be changing the accounting every time that fund goes above or below $2 million, creating a real administrative burden. The council is very interested in being able to put grants out to PSAPs. This isn't about just storing money in that fund. It is 100% about making sure that we're not spending more money, time, and effort on the accounting and administration of that fund than we are, and making sure it helps 911 centers. So that's what that cap piece is doing. The other item within the legislation, to be able to move the $1 million into the operations fund, into the treasury this year, wanted to explain that briefly. Currently, we are operating under a memorandum of agreement with the Department of Administration, where they pay our internal state expenses, payroll, IT expenses, things like that, and then send us an invoice and we pay them back. Because we don't exist currently within the state accounting system, we can't make use of the mechanisms through which state agencies compensate each other for services. So we have to have Department of Administration serve as our proxy for that. The idea behind starting the funds July 1st is that we get created inside the accounting system. And the idea of moving $1 million is that we have something in there to spend. Again, this is entirely for payroll and then compensating other state agencies for the various services we need as we spin up the agency. So I think that covers what I find to be the two most confusing bits, but I would stand for any questions anyone has.
Thank you. Body, do we have any questions for Ms. Massey? I think you must have hit it on the nail. So
wonderful. I did my best to put the written testimony, in the written testimony, a good detail of all of that. So hopefully you have that if any questions come up.
All right. Thank you for being here.
Wonderful.
We were trying to get Representative Hoffman in here as well, but he's not here at this point. So, pardon? Yeah, I know. He's tied up in some other stuff. So that's what's going on. What's that? Yeah. So would you like to make any further comments, Mr. Carmen?
Just very quickly, I think that Representative Hoffman's testimony was probably going to echo the principal testimony of Ms. Massey. Ms. Massey has worked extremely hard in making this transition work. And between her and Mr. Meyer, I think we've created a good bipartisan product, and I certainly stand behind it. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Would anybody else like to comment as a proponent for the bill? Not seeing any. I am showing no opponents and no neutral, unless somebody else would like to speak as a neutral or an opponent. Not seeing any. We'll go ahead and close the hearing on House Bill 2110. So moving on, I'd like to take final action now on House Bill 2109. Nick, what do we got here?
Yes, so committee, House Bill 2109 is the bill that requires public utilities to enter into pole attachment agreements with law enforcement agencies upon the request of the law enforcement agency. The bill, if you remember, does specify certain requirements that shall go into those pole attachment agreements, and does require the utility to indemnify, defend, and hold harmless the public utility from any and all actions relating to the attachment. And Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Any questions specifically for Nick? Not seeing any. Ms. Neighbor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With that overview, I would move that we pass out House Bill 2109 Favorably for passage for discussion.
And we have a second from Mr. Holheisel. So you've heard that body. Is there further discussion on House Bill 2109? Mr. Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's with great reluctance that I oppose this legislation. We hear from law enforcement this year, and we heard last year, about the good things that have happened. Last year it was tag readers. This year they haven't described it this way, but I think they're known as pan, tilt, zoom cameras. And they can solve crime. They can find missing children. They can apprehend kidnappers before assaults take place on children and adults as well. In fact, a friend of mine was murdered several years ago in Wichita, and as a result of a camera out on Interstate 135, they apprehended the murderer that very afternoon. So don't get me wrong. I think that this technology is important for the public safety. But here's the problem. Law enforcement has failed to secure those cameras and the data that arise therefrom. I think you may have heard one of our proponents take a good shot at me, and a valid one. Shot's a bad word in this context. Take a swipe at me, say, well, we're not here talking about tag readers. No, we're talking about cameras on poles looking into my backyard. That's even worse. But we know from the tag reader experience that, for example, officers in a lieutenant, I believe, in Keachai, Kansas, used the tag readers from Wichita, Kansas, to track his ex-spouse to find out what she and her new boyfriend were doing. We had episodes where people from law enforcement agencies from out of state accessed tag reader data from Wichita to track people down for personal reasons. Once again, an ex-spouse. We don't know how many intrusions there have been into the tag reader network because, at least under the Flock system, law enforcement officers or people with an access code in Ferguson, Missouri can find out where I am in Wichita, Kansas, for whatever nefarious purpose they might want to use it. Then we have the problem with the physical security and software security of these cameras. Motorola's tag reader cameras have been hacked. You can go on YouTube, if you wish, and just type in Motorola camera hack, and you can figure out how to do it yourself. Law enforcement, and by the way, there's no reason to believe it's not the same thing with respect to these pan, tilt, zoom cameras that they want to put, in essence, in my backyard. I don't oppose the idea of using these cameras, but law enforcement has to satisfy me that the appropriate security precautions are in place. And they knew it last year what my concern was. And they came back this year with a similar, frankly, dog and pony show about the good things, but continue to not address the security issues. And I'm not going to vote to facilitate this type of technology until law enforcement does its due diligence and secures its systems. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Absolutely appreciate your comments, Mr. Holheisel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am going to support this legislation today for the fact of what the previous representative just said at the beginning of his comments and all the great things that can come from this. I will point out that the Keachai incident, which is definitely not right, not cool, the individual was fired. The individual lost his certificate to be a cop in Kansas, and the individual was charged and sentenced. That to me shows the system works. Are we going to prevent 100% of bad guys trying to infiltrate, trying to use this in nefarious ways? No, but we're never going to do that for anything. But that Keachai incident shows that the whole system, the safeguards work. The individual was charged. He was convicted, rightfully so. And the safeguards are in there, so I'm going to support this. I encourage the committee to support this. This is much needed. It's another tool for our law enforcement friends to keep us safe.
Thank you. Further discussion? Mr. Penn?
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, committee, for indulging me one more time. I think as I spoke on, and joining you guys via Zoom or WebEx the other day, I am a strong proponent of this legislation. I think that is a necessary and proper tool for us to ensure that our citizens are both safe, but that we partner with our law enforcement community as well as private industry if they come to that agreement to make that so. I told you that this had direct effect on my family. Because when we took the vote on saving women's sports, the media here in the State House put my name in the newspapers, and we had people coming by our house threatening myself, my family, 2 hours away, my wife and kids. And we did not have this capability to find out who the culprits were. It happened to other legislators as well, some of you know. It was a pretty harrowing experience because for us to come and do the business of the state for our constituents, for the will of the people here in Kansas, even though we may disagree, the numbers speak for themselves, and they send us here, whatever party and whatever affiliation and ideology we represent. That said, even if you disagree, you should not be threatening people's lives. You should not be threatening to harm legislators' families, their children. Let that sink in. There's stuff that we can do here in this legislature that has great impact. This is one of those bills. I will be in strong support of it. I ask that you all do the same. Let's get this out to the floor and get it to the governor's desk. And if there's a problem with it, let's override a veto. It's that season. Let's go.
Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Very quickly, number one, we don't need to be talking about governor's vetoes right now. We need to be legislating and doing the right thing. And number two, it's not persuasive to me for legislators to be very concerned about their own personal safety. We ought to be concerned about our constituents' safety and our constituents' privacy, which is just as important in this republic. And I recognize my good friend, Representative Hoheisel's comments that the officer in Keachai was decertified, convicted of a misdemeanor, if I recollect. 2 misdemeanors, the representative indicates. Slap on the wrist. But the point is, law enforcement needs to be proactive in protecting this sensitive data, not reactive, because we don't know how many incursions there's been into that data, where the law enforcement officer or just a hacker got access to what people were doing in the privacy of their own backyard. So I can't support this. Thank you.
Further discussion?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, if I may. It takes a special kind of crass person to dismiss threats on people's lives and their children. The representative said that we should not be concerned about our own personal safety, but that of our constituents. Shock. My wife is my constituent. That said, it's always the right time to talk about playing chess and not checkers. That's why we stay in front of these bills, what the process is, and understand where it's going to head to. As I stated, when we first had the first discussion on this, all of the boogeyman fears of privacy, there's no expectation, reasonable expectation of privacy, according to that case that came out of the 10th Circuit, for what you're doing in the public. You've heard from the testimony of all of those who have presented, the proponents as well. You've read it, and it's prima facie that this is not harming anyone's sense of privacy. If they're out in the public, if you're on the street corner, where it's plain view, that can be captured. It is captured. Go to Google Earth, Google Maps right now. So the bottom line up front is I take great umbrage with the concept that in order to push a particular ideological talking point or set of out of alignment values, that we would dismiss recorded, clear, present threats to people's lives in order to hear ourselves wax poetic and pontificate. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to leave the rest of this discussion alone into the will of the body. Thank you.
Thank you. Further discussion? Ms. Neighbor, would you like to move your motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With the discussion that we had, you know, we have a lot of technology available to us. And I think we're in the baby steps, even though technology has been around. But what we're able to do with it today, as we watch it grow, we know at any time, any system can be hacked. There's someone smarter than I am, or that smarter than you are, that can hack a system. They might be third graders. They're not going to be my age because I'm too old to understand. But the reality is, this is a tool in the toolbox. This is something that I believe will help our law enforcement to capture those that are doing wrong, those that can do harm. And for that, we are lucky to have this opportunity. With that, Mr. Chairman, and not to dispute the words of two representatives here speaking back and forth, because we all have our right to our own decision-making power. But I move that we pass out House Bill 2109, is that correct? Favorable for passage, and give our law enforcement community the ability to do their jobs to the best of their knowledge. There are bad players in every business, but most of our men in blue are there to protect us. Our men and women in blue, pardon me, let me not leave that out. And I think as we continue to approach our knowledge and what we have available to us with technology, we need to be ever mindful, but we also have to respect what it can do to make our country safer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Neighbor. Extremely good comments. I appreciate you being here. So, body, you've heard the motion. All in favor, please say aye. All opposed? Would you like your comment recorded, Mr. Carmichael?
Yes, I would, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your
Do
courtesy.
that. Anyone else with? Yes, for a negative. Mr. Penn would like a positive, and Mr. Smith would like a positive. Anyone else would like to have their comments recorded? All right. Thank you, body. That will advance on to the floor. And that does conclude the hearing on 2109. Next meeting is Tuesday, February 3rd. We've got 2 hearings and 1 final action. We're going to be hearing 2107, providing for claims to recover damages from fire events by electric public utilities. We're going to hear 2225, prohibiting mobile home parks landlords from limiting tenants' access to communications and video service. And we're going to have a final action on the 911 bill you heard, 2110. With that, further questions, Mr. Roth? February 11th. If I said the 3rd, I am sorry. February 11th. Next Tuesday, February 11th. Okay. That's right. So, all right. We are dismissed. Thank you.